Smoke rose from the twisted metal carcass of a once mighty war machine, curling into the sky like a dying breath. Sergeant Derek Klein sat behind the crumbling wall of a bombed-out convenience store, clutching his battered radio transmitter like a lifeline. His face was streaked with dirt, a crimson gash tracing down his left cheek. The stench of burnt flesh clung to his clothes. Human, alien, it didn't matter anymore. They were all just corpses now. He licked his dry lips, knowing this broadcast might be his last. "This is Sergeant Derek Klein, Earth's last soldier." His voice rasped, barely above a whisper. "If you're out there, we're still fighting. Humanity is still fighting." He paused, staring at the twisted remains of what had once been his squad, men and women who had trusted him to lead them to victory. He was all that was left. "We've regrouped," he continued, injecting false bravado into his voice. "Sector 7 is fortified. We've got weapons. We've got reinforcements coming in from the south. If you're a survivor, if you're listening, we're holding the line. Come to Sector 7. We'll protect you." Derek clicked the transmitter off and slumped back against the wall. The lie felt heavier than his battered armor. There was no Sector 7 resistance. There were no reinforcements. Humanity's defenses had crumbled months ago. He was alone. His transmission was nothing more than a desperate bluff, a futile attempt to make the Virex believe Earth still had some fight left. Suddenly, a whirring noise cut through the silence, the unmistakable sound of a Virex scout drone. Derek's eyes shot open. He yanked his rifle from the ground and held his breath as the spherical machine drifted past the ruins. It hovered just meters away, scanning for signs of life. His finger hovered over the trigger, but he knew better. One shot would bring an entire Virex patrol swarming to his position. Instead, he stayed still, counting the seconds, feeling his pulse thunder in his ears. The drone finally drifted away, vanishing behind the jagged remnants of a collapsed building. Derek exhaled sharply, forcing himself to breathe. He knew it wouldn't be long before something worse than a drone arrived. The Virex didn't just hunt for humans, they toyed with them. Earth wasn't a battleground anymore. It was a twisted game preserve, and Derek was their prized trophy. Miles above Earth's charred landscape, aboard the Virex command ship, Zyriel stood before a glowing holographic display. The last signal from Derek's transmission flickered before him, each word catalogued and analyzed by Virex translators. "He's bluffing," Zyriel sneered, his violet-scaled face twisting into a smug grin. "Humans don't regroup. They scatter. This fool is pretending he's not alone." "What if he's telling the truth?" one of his lieutenants asked. "Then we crush them," Zyriel said coldly. "No more playing games. This one dies tonight." Meanwhile, Derek scavenged supplies from the wreckage of a nearby pharmacy. The shelves had been stripped bare months ago, but he found a few bandages and a half-empty bottle of painkillers. He chuckled bitterly as he shoved them into his bag. Winning this war with band-aids and aspirin, that seemed about right. As he climbed back outside, a shadow fell across him. Derek spun, rifle raised, but it wasn't a Virex. A figure stood before him, clad in patchwork armor scavenged from both human and alien tech. Its face was masked by a sleek helmet, and Derek's instincts screamed danger. "You're Derek Klein," the figure said, voice distorted by a mechanical filter. "I heard your broadcast." Derek's finger twitched on the trigger. "You're human?" "Not quite," the figure said, removing the helmet. Beneath it, a gray-skinned face with faint ridges along the brow stared back. "Alien, but not Virex." "I'm Crixus," the stranger said. "I'm here to help you." Derek kept his rifle raised. "Help me?" he spat. "Your kind started this war. I'm not one of them," Crixus said firmly. "I'm Virex-born, yes, but I was cast out when I refused to hunt your people." He spread his arms wide, showing no weapons. "I know you're bluffing about Sector 7. There's no army. No reinforcements. But if we make them believe there is..." Derek narrowed his eyes. "Why should I trust you?" "Because Zyriel's on his way," Crixus said grimly. And you're not going to survive without me. Moments later, the sky erupted with fiery streaks as Virex drop pods descended like burning meteors. Derek gritted his teeth, forcing down the rising panic. We need to go, Crixus said urgently. Go where? Derek growled. We're out of time. Not yet, Crixus grinned. We make a stand. And this time, we give the Virex a fight they'll never forget. The first wave hit fast, Virex drones scanning every street corner, while heavily armored hunters scoured the wreckage. Derek and Crixus set traps, planting homemade explosives beneath fallen rubble. A Virex patrol stumbled too close, and a deafening boom sent debris and alien limbs flying through the air. That's one, Derek muttered. They kept moving, dodging patrols and sneaking through ruined alleys. Every time Derek reached for his radio, he hesitated. The lie had worked once, but how far could he push it? You're going to need to use that again, Crixus said as they ducked behind a rusted-out vehicle. If they know I'm still alive, they'll send everything they've got, Derek replied. They're already doing that, Crixus shot back. If you stop broadcasting, they'll know you're on the run. We need to make them think you're still in control. Derek clenched his fists. He knew Crixus was right. Grabbing the radio from his pack, he pressed the transmit button. This is Sergeant Derek Klein, he said. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. We've repelled the first wave. The resistance is holding strong. If you're listening, we're still here. Sector 7 stands. The words felt like poison on his tongue, but they had the desired effect. Minutes later, Virex scouts doubled back toward the traps they'd planted, searching for a non-existent resistance force. Derek and Crixus seized the moment, slipping past their lines and heading deeper into the ruins. You're a good liar, Crixus remarked as they hurried down a side street. I used to sell cars, Derek muttered. Not much different. The humor broke some of the tension, but Derek knew the worst was yet to come. The Virex weren't just here to hunt him down, they were here to finish what they started. And if his lies couldn't hold them back, Earth's last soldier wouldn't live long enough to send another signal. As the night closed in, Derek clutched his rifle tightly, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on him. He had no army, no reinforcements, no hope. But somewhere out there, someone was still listening. And as long as that was true, he knew he couldn't give up. If you're out there, Derek whispered to the night, keep fighting. Derek Klein wiped the sweat from his brow as he and Crixus crept through the shattered remains of an old train yard. Twisted steel beams jutted from the ground like jagged teeth, and the air smelled of rust and decay. The Virex had landed 2 hours ago, and already the streets were crawling with their patrols. Drones glided low through the wreckage, scanning for heat signatures. Occasionally, a beam of crimson light flickered past their hiding spot, slicing the darkness. Derek's heart pounded each time one of those lights passed over them. The Virex never stopped hunting. They're moving faster than I thought, Derek whispered as he peeked around the corner of a wrecked locomotive. They're not wasting time anymore, Crixus muttered. Your broadcast spooked them. Zyriel knows you're the last soldier standing. If he crushes you, Earth's resistance dies, or at least that's what he believes. Derek frowned. The weight of it all pressed down on him like a collapsing ceiling. He had survived this long by being smart, by outwitting patrols and avoiding direct combat. Now, his own lie had become a noose tightening around his neck. The Virex weren't here to patrol anymore, they were here to finish the job. A screech echoed through the train yard. Derek's head jerked toward the sound. A Virex hound, a twisted fusion of organic muscle and mechanical limbs, leapt onto a rusted rail car. Its 6 glowing eyes swept across the debris-strewn tracks. Derek froze, gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles turned white. The beast's snarl rumbled low and deep as it sniffed the air, closing in on their hiding spot. We're about to have company, Derek whispered. I'll take care of it, Crixus said. Before Derek could argue, Crixus slipped away into the shadows. Derek watched as the hound's ears perked, sensing movement. It bounded toward Crixus' position, muscles rippling beneath its armor-plated hide. Derek tensed, expecting to hear the sounds of a brutal fight, but instead there was silence. Moments later, Crixus returned, wiping greenish-black blood from his blade. "Handled," Crixus said. "But they'll know something's wrong when that hound doesn't report back." "Then we need to keep moving," Derek muttered. They pushed on through the wreckage, navigating alleyways littered with shattered glass and skeletal remains. Derek tried not to think about the bodies, some human, some alien, all victims of the Virex's twisted game. The silence was almost worse than the gunfire he remembered from earlier battles. At least back then, there had been a sense that humanity still had a chance. Now, it felt like he was crawling through a graveyard, one wrong step away from joining the dead. After what felt like hours, they reached the outskirts of Sector 7, or what was left of it. The once bustling district was a maze of collapsed buildings and scorched asphalt. Derek could see distant figures moving between the wreckage, human survivors scavenging for supplies or trying to stay out of sight. "You lied about Sector 7, Crixus muttered. "But it seems some people believed you." Derek felt a pang of guilt. His fake transmission had given people false hope, and now they were here, risking their lives because of a lie. But there was no time for regret. The Virex would swarm this place soon, and unless Derek found a way to turn the lie into truth, Sector 7 would become a mass grave. "We need to get those people out," Derek said. "If they stay here, they'll be slaughtered." "You'll never convince them to leave," Crixus replied. "They think you're a leader, a soldier with a plan. If you tell them to run now, they'll think you're giving up." Derek cursed under his breath. He wasn't a leader. He was a survivor, nothing more. But if those people believed in him, he couldn't let them die. "We'll make a stand," Derek said. "We set traps, bottleneck their forces, and hit them where it hurts. We make Zyriel think the resistance is stronger than it actually is." Crixus's expression hardened. "That's suicide." "We don't have a choice," Derek shot back. "If they're going to fight, they need something to believe in. They need to believe they have a chance." With no time to waste, Derek and Crixus moved quickly, gathering what survivors they could find. Derek stood before them, a grim-faced group of civilians, scavengers, and broken soldiers. They stared at him with wide eyes, some hopeful, others doubtful. "We're going to hold this ground," Derek said firmly. "The Virex think they're walking into a victory, but we're going to give them hell. We know these streets, they don't. We've got the advantage. We fight smart, we hit hard, and we stay alive." Some nodded, others whispered among themselves. Derek knew they didn't fully believe him, but he also knew they had nothing left to lose. They worked quickly, wiring old explosives beneath rubble piles and creating makeshift barricades from overturned cars. Derek took charge, positioning survivors at key points where they could launch surprise attacks. Crixus stalked the perimeter like a phantom, quietly eliminating any scouts that drew too close. The first wave came just before dawn, Virex drones scanning the streets, followed closely by armored hunters moving in formation. Derek waited, heart hammering in his chest. The moment the lead squad reached the first booby trap, Derek triggered the explosives. The street erupted in a thunderous blast, flinging debris and alien limbs skyward. "Go!" Derek shouted. Survivors poured from the alleyways, unleashing a hail of gunfire and makeshift explosives. The Virex stumbled in confusion, their ranks breaking as explosions ripped through their lines. Derek fired from behind a crumbling wall, picking off stragglers with precision. For a brief moment, hope sparked inside him. They were winning. Then the second wave arrived. Zyriel's elite soldiers pushed through the smoke, their black armor gleaming in the morning light. They moved with brutal efficiency, cutting down survivors with cold precision. Derek saw a teenager fall just meters away from him, her scream lost in the chaos. Rage boiled inside him. He grabbed his radio and pressed the transmit button. "This is Sergeant Derek Klein," he growled. "Sector 7 is still standing. If you're out there, if you're listening, join us. We're holding the line. We're not giving up." The words tumbled out before he realized what he'd done. He knew there was no one left to answer the call, but still, he hoped. Maybe someone, somewhere, would hear him. As Derek turned back to the fight, he saw Crixus battling Zyriel himself. The Virex commander moved with terrifying speed, his jagged blade striking sparks from Crixus' armor. Derek raised his rifle and fired. The shot grazed Zyriel's arm, forcing him to retreat just long enough for Crixus to strike back. The alien commander snarled, vanishing into the smoke. The battle stretched on for hours. By the time it ended, Sector 7 was a smoldering ruin. Dozens lay dead, and Derek felt the bitter taste of failure rising in his throat. He staggered through the wreckage, searching for survivors. Crixus limped to his side, blood dripping from a deep wound in his arm. "We held them off," Crixus said grimly. "But they'll be back." Derek's hand tightened around his radio. His bluff had sparked a fight he hadn't been sure they could win, but for now, Sector 7 still stood. And as long as someone was listening, Derek knew he had to keep fighting. "If you're out there," Derek whispered once again into the radio, "we're still here." The morning after the battle was cold and quiet. Smoke hung low in the air, clinging to the ruined streets like a shroud. Derek Klein knelt beside a fallen soldier, a young man barely out of his teens. The boy's face was pale, his eyes still open, frozen in an expression of disbelief. Derek reached out and closed the boy's eyes, swallowing the lump in his throat. He didn't know the kid's name. There were too many strangers fighting beside him now, but that didn't make the loss any easier. Crixus appeared behind him, clutching his wounded side. The alien's face was grim, yet there was something in his eyes that Derek hadn't seen before: respect. For hours they had fought side by side, battling wave after wave of Virex soldiers. By some miracle, they had survived. Sector 7 was a ruin, but they had held their ground. For the first time since the war had started, Derek felt something resembling hope. "They're not done," Crixus muttered. "Zyriel doesn't lose and walk away. He's regrouping." Derek knew Crixus was right. Zyriel's elite forces had pulled back when the battle turned against them, but the Virex weren't retreating, they were recalculating. Derek's broadcast had convinced the Virex command that Sector 7 was a stronghold, one capable of resisting an invasion force. The truth was far more fragile. Most of the survivors who had joined the fight were wounded or exhausted. Ammunition was running low, and Derek doubted they could survive another assault. "We need to make them believe this place is stronger than it is," Derek said, his voice low. "We can't stop fighting now. If we can hold out long enough, someone out there might still be listening." Crixus stared at him for a long moment. "Your lies keep getting bigger." "It's the only thing that's worked so far," Derek replied. "If I stop now, we're finished." They spent the next few hours moving through the wreckage, gathering survivors and fortifying what little they had left. Old pipes and concrete slabs were dragged into place to create makeshift barricades. Derek found a few working radios and had the remaining fighters scatter them across the district, broadcasting a series of fake signals. He wanted the Virex to believe the resistance was far larger than it really was. By the time night fell, Derek and Crixus stood on a rooftop, watching the distant glow of Virex forces assembling on the horizon. They were coming back, and this time, they weren't going to underestimate their enemy. "I'll buy us time," Crixus said quietly. "If I can get close enough to their command ship, I can sabotage their communications. Without orders, the soldiers will hesitate. You won't make it back," Derek warned. "I know," Crixus said. "But I'd rather die fighting than live with what I was." Derek didn't argue. Crixus had risked everything to help him, and now he was willing to sacrifice himself to give humanity a fighting chance. Derek didn't like it, but he respected it. Crixus disappeared into the shadows while Derek returned to the front lines. The survivors gathered behind the barricades, tired, battered faces staring at him for direction. Some carried rifles, others held improvised weapons, bats, pipes, whatever they could find. Most of them had no military training. Derek knew he couldn't ask them to believe in a victory. He could only ask them to survive. When they come, Derek said, we hit them hard. We make them think there's more of us than there really is. Don't stand and fight, strike fast, disappear, and strike again. Keep moving. Confuse them. Make them think they're surrounded. He didn't know if it would work, but it was better than waiting to be slaughtered. As the Virex forces drew closer, Derek clutched his rifle tightly, silently hoping that Crixus had made it to his target. The Virex assault began without warning. Drones swarmed overhead, pouring streams of plasma fire down on the barricades. Derek ducked as sparks showered around him. Explosions rocked the ground, and cries echoed from nearby streets. The air was thick with smoke, and Derek's eyes stung as he fired blindly at shadowy figures moving through the haze. The plan was chaos, but it worked. The scattered defenders fired from alleyways and rooftops, disappearing before the Virex could lock onto them. Traps set earlier in the day erupted in bursts of shrapnel, slowing the enemy's advance. The Virex forces moved cautiously, their commanders uncertain if they were walking into an ambush. Derek moved constantly, shouting orders through his radio, encouraging fighters to shift positions, strike again, and vanish. Hours passed, and the Virex advance slowed to a crawl. Derek dared to believe they might actually win, until the sky darkened. A deafening roar shook the streets as Zyriel's command ship descended directly above the district. The warlord had grown impatient. Elite Virex soldiers leapt from the ship, landing in clusters of black-armored warriors. Derek's heart sank as they carved through the defenders like scythes through dry grass. The battle became a slaughter. Derek moved through the chaos, shouting for the fighters to retreat deeper into the city. He knew the district was lost, but if they could break away, there was still hope. He fired until his rifle clicked empty, then drew his pistol, covering a small group of survivors as they fled down a crumbled stairwell. Out of the smoke, Zyriel emerged. The Virex commander stood taller than any of his soldiers, his armor jagged and streaked with dark crimson symbols. His face twisted into a grin as he spotted Derek. "I've been waiting for this," Zyriel growled. Derek fired his last shot, but Zyriel swatted the bullet aside with a flick of his blade. Before Derek could react, Zyriel lunged, slashing through Derek's armor and sending him crashing to the ground. "You should have stayed quiet," Zyriel sneered. "Your lies are finished." Derek spat blood, gripping his radio with trembling fingers. His vision blurred, but he forced himself to press the transmit button one last time. "If you're out there," Derek whispered, his voice thin and weak, "Sector 7 is still standing." Zyriel's blade rose above Derek's chest, and then the sky flashed. The Virex command ship erupted in flames as Crixus' sabotage took effect. The Virex soldiers faltered, their chain of command severed. Derek forced himself to his knees as surviving defenders surged forward, pushing back the confused Virex forces. Zyriel's eyes widened in disbelief before he snarled and disappeared into the smoke. Derek collapsed to the ground, his breath shallow. Crixus stumbled from the wreckage, clutching his side. His face was pale, his strength failing, but he smiled faintly. "You lied again," Crixus rasped. "Yeah," Derek muttered. But this time, they believed it. Derek's fingers still clutched the radio as he spoke again. "If you're out there," he said softly, "we're still here, and we're still fighting." The morning after the battle was colder than any Derek Klein could remember. The air was heavy with the acrid stench of smoke and death, the streets littered with the broken bodies of both human and Virex soldiers. The ruins of Sector 7 stretched out before him, a graveyard of twisted metal and charred stone. Fires smoldered in the distance, flickering like dying candles against the gray sky. Derek sat on the cracked pavement, cradling his wounded arm and feeling the weight of everything that had happened. His body ached, his ribs felt like they were on fire, and blood crusted the side of his face where Zyriel's blade had grazed him. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he was still alive. Against all odds, he had survived. Crixus staggered into view, limping badly and clutching a blood-soaked rag against his side. His gray skin was pale, his breath shallow, but there was still a spark of defiance in his eyes. Derek struggled to his feet and helped the aliens sit down beside him. Crixus groaned, leaning heavily against a broken concrete barrier. "We won," Crixus muttered, his voice hoarse. "I can't believe it, but we actually won." Derek let out a dry, humorless laugh. "If you can call this winning," he said. "Half the survivors are dead. The other half are wounded. And Zyriel's still out there." Crixus grimaced. "He's not coming back anytime soon. Without his command ship, he's got no way to communicate with his fleet. He'll regroup, but not right away." Derek knew that was true, but it offered little comfort. They had bought time, but not much. The Virex wouldn't just forget about Earth. They'd return stronger, angrier, and more determined to wipe out what little humanity remained. Derek's bluff had saved them for now, but lies could only take him so far. As he stared out at the ruined district, Derek's fingers unconsciously reached for his radio. He had used it to weave the illusion of a resistance that didn't exist, convincing scattered survivors that they weren't alone. The lie had grown larger than he had ever intended, and somehow, impossibly, it had kept hope alive. He wondered if anyone else had heard his final broadcast, the one he had sent just before Crixus brought down the command ship. He wondered if someone out there still believed in a resistance that didn't truly exist. A faint crackle broke through the static in his earpiece. Derek's heart skipped a beat, and he quickly adjusted the dial. "This is Sector 9, we heard your broadcast," a voice stammered through the static. "We've been hiding, 20 of us, supplies running low, but we're still here." Derek's breath caught in his throat. He thought for sure his final transmission had been a futile whisper in the dark, but someone had heard him. Someone believed in the lie, and because of that, they had held on. "This is Sergeant Derek Klein," he said, pressing the transmit button. "Sector 7 is still standing. If you can make it here, we'll keep you safe." More voices followed. Some were faint, others distorted by static, but all were the same, desperate voices of people who had heard Derek's broadcast and believed they weren't alone. Bunkers in the north. Hidden groups scavenging in the west. Stragglers who had spent months hiding in cellars and ruined shelters. They had all believed Sector 7 was a stronghold, and now that belief was becoming a reality. Crixus shook his head in disbelief. "You lied your way into creating a real army." "I lied because I had no choice," Derek said quietly. "But now I have one." Over the next few days, survivors trickled into Sector 7, some limping, some dragging carts of supplies, others armed with whatever weapons they had managed to salvage. Derek greeted each of them personally, feeling the weight of their trust settling on his shoulders. He knew the truth: they weren't soldiers. Most of them had never even fired a gun. But they had something the Virex didn't: hope. Derek knew they couldn't hold out forever. Supplies were dwindling, and many of the survivors were too weak or injured to fight. He gathered a small group of fighters, those still able-bodied, and began training them with whatever weapons they had. Old rifles, scavenged plasma weapons, even sharpened pipes, anything that could be used to defend what little they had left. Derek's experience as a soldier kept him grounded, but deep down he knew their strength wasn't in their weapons. It was in their belief that they still had something to fight for. Days turned to weeks, and Derek kept up the illusion. His broadcasts grew bolder, feeding rumors of an unstoppable human resistance force. He claimed there were hidden weapon caches, bunkers filled with supplies, and highly trained fighters stationed across Earth. None of it was true, but it didn't matter. The Virex's paranoia spread like wildfire. Reports reached Derek that Virex patrols were abandoning key outposts, believing they were being surrounded by invisible resistance cells. Fear had turned the Virex's own soldiers into hesitant, second-guessing hunters. But Derek knew it couldn't last forever. One evening, as Derek was inspecting the outer perimeter, a low rumble shook the air. He turned toward the horizon and froze. A dark shape was rising from the sky, a Virex warship. Larger than anything Derek had seen before, it loomed above the skyline like a mountain of metal and death. This was no simple hunting party. This was an extermination fleet. We can't stop that, Crixus said grimly as he limped to Derek's side. They're not here to scare you anymore. They're here to finish this. Derek stared at the massive ship and clenched his fists. His lies had pushed the Virex too far. He had convinced them Earth was dangerous, and now they were determined to wipe it from existence. Then we make them believe one last time, Derek said. That night, Derek broadcast a final message, his boldest lie yet. He claimed the Resistance had stolen Virex war technology. He claimed Earth had reverse-engineered Virex weapons and was preparing to strike. He spoke with absolute conviction, weaving a story so outrageous it had to be true. He knew it wouldn't stop the incoming fleet, but maybe, just maybe, it would slow them down long enough for survivors to escape. Hours later, the unexpected happened. The Virex fleet didn't attack. Instead, their massive warship drifted back into orbit. Derek stared in disbelief as the Virex withdrew, their forces pulling back from Earth's surface. The message had done more than he intended, it had terrified them. The Virex believed Earth had become more dangerous than they were willing to risk. Fear had driven them away. For the first time in months, Derek allowed himself to hope. The survivors gathered that night, some weeping, others cheering. Derek stood quietly, watching the flickering lights of the Virex fleet fade into the distance. Crixus stood beside him, smiling faintly. You're a dangerous man, Crixus said. I just knew what they were afraid of, Derek replied. Crixus shook his head. No. You knew what people needed to believe. Derek didn't answer. Instead, he lifted his radio one final time. If you're out there, he said softly, we're still here. And we're still fighting. The survivors around him fell silent, listening to the words that had once been a lie, but now felt like the truth. Earth had survived. Derek had survived. And as long as someone was still listening, hope would never die. The night after the Virex fleet retreated was one of the quietest Derek Klein had experienced in months. The silence felt unnatural, like the air itself was holding its breath. Survivors huddled in the ruins of Sector 7, some too exhausted to celebrate, others too traumatized to sleep. The fires had burned down to embers, and the city's twisted skeleton cast long shadows across the streets. Derek sat alone on a crumbled wall, gripping his battered radio as though it were the last thread keeping him tied to reality. His hand hovered over the transmit button. For months, his voice had been a weapon, a lie spun into something larger than he had ever imagined. The lie had saved them, but Derek knew that survival didn't mean victory. The Virex would return. Next time, they wouldn't retreat because of fear. Next time, they would come with fire and fury, and no amount of deception would stop them. Derek stared at the ruined horizon and wondered how long they had left. Footsteps crunched on broken glass behind him. Derek didn't turn. He knew it was Crixus. The alien moved slower now, still recovering from the deep wound he'd taken in the battle. His breathing was labored, his face paler than before, but somehow he kept going. Derek had grown used to his presence, and despite their differences, Crixus had become the closest thing to a friend Derek had left. They won't stay away forever, Crixus said quietly. They're regrouping. Planning. I know, Derek replied. His voice was hoarse, drained of the false confidence he had relied on for so long. I've seen this before, Crixus continued. On other worlds. The Virex always pull back when they sense unexpected resistance, but they don't give up. They'll return stronger, with better tactics, and they'll burn everything to the ground. Derek closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. He already knew that. Every part of him knew it. The question wasn't if they would come back, it was when. We need more than lies, Derek muttered. We need real strength. You've already built that, Crixus said. You've brought people together. They're not soldiers, but they believe in you. That's enough to give you time. Derek shook his head. Time won't stop an invasion fleet. I need something more. The memory of the warship lingered in his mind, that massive, looming shadow above the earth. If the Virex believed Derek had access to their stolen technology, he knew he couldn't afford to let that lie die. He needed to turn that fiction into reality. Without warning, Derek stood and walked back toward the remnants of their makeshift command post. Crixus followed him, his steps uneven but determined. Derek shoved open the warped door of what had once been a mechanic's garage, now converted into a central hub for the survivors. The tables were cluttered with salvaged radios, half-functional weapons, and scrap metal repurposed into crude defenses. Derek spotted a small group of engineers, scavengers and mechanics who had been patching together weapons since the battle. He strode toward them, his voice sharp. "Do you know anything about alien tech?" Derek asked. One of the men, a wiry mechanic with grease-streaked hands, scratched his beard. "We've been picking apart the drones that got shot down. Some weird stuff in there, but we're figuring it out." "Why?" "We need to do more than figure it out," Derek said. "We need to build something. Something big." The mechanic exchanged nervous glances with the others. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking if the Virex are scared of human technology, maybe it's time we give them something to be scared of." The next few days were a blur of chaos and urgency. Derek worked with the engineers, scavenging whatever functional Virex components they could pull from destroyed drones and damaged weapons. They spent hours stripping wires, rewiring control systems, and connecting stolen power cells to human technology. The result was crude, clunky, and barely stable, but it was a start. One of the key devices they developed was a signal jammer, a device that mimicked Virex command transmissions and disrupted their communications. If it worked, it would confuse the Virex when they returned, breaking their coordination and giving Earth survivors a fighting chance. Derek knew it wasn't enough, but it was better than nothing. As they tested the jammer on a captured Virex drone, Crixus stood nearby, arms crossed. "You're gambling on a bluff again," Crixus muttered. Derek gave a tired smile. "I've got nothing else." "You can't keep pushing your luck," Crixus warned. "Lies don't hold up forever." "I know," Derek said quietly. "But right now, lies are all we've got." On the fourth night, the signal came. The static in Derek's earpiece shifted, replaced by a deep, distorted voice, a Virex transmission. The language was harsh and guttural, but Crixus' face turned grim as he translated. "They're sending scouts," Crixus muttered. "They're testing the area before they commit their full force." Derek clenched his fists. He knew this was inevitable. The Virex weren't finished with Earth. The only question now was whether they could hold out. "We fight them like before," Derek said. "We don't let them know how weak we are. We hit hard, disappear, hit again. They'll adapt," Crixus warned. "They won't fall for the same tricks twice. Then we give them something new," Derek replied. The following night, Derek and a handful of his strongest fighters planted the signal jammer in the heart of Sector 7's ruins. As Virex scouts began sweeping the area, Derek activated the device. The effect was immediate. Virex patrols stumbled, drones veered off course, and command channels buzzed with garbled confusion. Derek's fighters seized the opportunity, striking fast and retreating before the Virex could regroup. Explosions lit the streets, and for a time, it seemed as though Derek's desperate plan was working. But the Virex weren't finished. Hours later, the Earth trembled as a second warship entered the atmosphere, a smaller, sleeker craft designed for precision strikes. The air filled with shrieking drones and armored Virex soldiers moving in coordinated waves. The signal jammer held them off briefly, but the Virex adapted faster than Derek expected. Derek's fighters fought desperately, but they were overwhelmed. As Derek ducked behind a collapsed wall, he heard Crixus shouting from across the street. The alien limped toward him, bleeding from a wound in his side. "They're breaking through," Crixus gasped. "We can't stop this one." Derek looked at the scattered survivors falling back through the streets. If the Virex pushed forward now, there would be no second chance. "I'll draw them away," Derek said suddenly. "You won't make it," Crixus shot back. "I'm not planning to," Derek muttered. Before Crixus could argue, Derek bolted down the street, firing his rifle wildly at approaching Virex soldiers. Plasma shots scorched the air around him as Derek sprinted deeper into the ruins. He kept firing, knowing they would follow him. He turned down an alley, diving behind a pile of debris just as the pursuing soldiers closed in. Derek gripped his radio tightly and whispered one final message. "If you're out there, if you're still listening, Earth isn't finished yet." Before the Virex could strike, the air behind them erupted in flame. Crixus had detonated one of their last explosives, scattering the alien forces and giving the survivors a chance to escape.